Hello there, my name's Stefan and welcome to the 60th Presents. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about the uniforms and equipment worn by soldiers in British light infantry units during the French and Indian War. Now, before we do that, it's probably worth saying a little bit about what we mean by light infantry. When we say light infantry, what I mean is referring to soldiers who had adapted their uniforms, their equipment, their clothing and their tactics to suit the woods and forests of North America. You see, the British Army up until the 7 Years' War, up until the French and Indian War as it's known in the States, tended to fight in large set-piece battles of the kind that you might expect to find on the European continent. This tended to mean that individual infantry soldiers would spend most of the battle, or a large part of the battle, either marching around in columns or lines, or standing shoulder to shoulder, firing volleys at their enemy before charging in with a musket and a bayonet. Now, this form of warfare did take place in North America. However, in forested terrain, it isn't really practical, and so the British Army had to adapt to this. An early way they adapted was to make use of ranger companies. Now, rangers have been a phenomenon on the North American continent for quite a while. As soon as Europeans came over and started setting up colonies, they realised that those colonies needed to be defended. One way that colonists defended themselves was to form groups of armed woodsmen who would patrol the area, patrol the frontier around their towns, looking for evidence of perhaps Native American raids or raiding parties coming into their area. These rangers became very useful to the British Army when it came to fighting the French. You see, the French had worked much more closely with the natives, and so had adapted much more effectively to the woods and forests of the continent. What this meant was that the British had to find a way of countering that, and as I say, the early response was the Rangers. The Rangers became very well known. They conducted some very famous raids, and some of their leaders, men like Robert Rogers, are even remembered today for the innovative nature of the tactics that they developed. However, there was a problem with the Rangers. You see, there are only a limited number of woodsmen to recruit into the Rangers, and so quite quickly casualties meant that ranger companies had to start recruiting in towns, in cities, and in particular on docks and so on. Now, this meant that the quality of the recruits that they were getting deteriorated, and British officers, particularly regular officers, began to realise, or began to think that the only way they could guarantee the quality of information being brought back from ranging parties or scouting parties, as well as the kind of the offensive capabilities of the Rangers, was to form their own units to fight in the forests, and these units became known as light infantry. Quite often these light infantry units would be trained by ranger companies, would work closely with them, and the idea was that they would provide a compromise. They would provide the skills and expertise needed to fight in woods and forests and to engage with the French and their native allies sort of on their own terms, and at the same time have the discipline to operate as part of the regular army. And that's what the light infantry was. Now, before we start looking at the uniforms that light infantrymen wore, the equipment they carried, I think it's probably worth adding a small caveat. You see, when you recreate a soldier of a line company or a line regiment, a line infantryman, there are a lot of resources to look at. You know, we have requests for resources, we have issuing lists, we have all kinds of documents from quartermasters and so on. We also have a lot of illustrations and pictures. Unfortunately, whilst there is material to work with for the light infantry, this is much more limited, and so I think it's important to say that what I'm about to show you is very much our best guess at what light infantrymen carried, the way they were equipped and what they used. But please do see it as something of a work in process. We have based it on first-hand accounts or first-hand documentation wherever possible, and I'll try and talk about that a little bit. But do remember that we are learning all the time, we are developing this all the time. And so if you have any comments or if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask in the comments section. Now, I think the best way to approach this is perhaps to start from the top and work their way down and talk about what I'm wearing and how it is adapted to this environment. Now, obviously starting at the top, as you can see, I have my hat. Now, During the 18th century, everybody wore a hat. It was seen as quite rude to be seen outside without a hat. Soldiers were no different. And the hat that most soldiers were issued was a tricorn. Now, if I show you this is perhaps to give you an idea of the kind of tricorn that was worn by British soldiers during the 7 Years' War. As you can see, it's trimmed with white, it has 3 corners, and it's not a hugely practical piece of equipment, or item of clothing I should say. Because the brim is folded up, it offers you absolutely no protection from the elements. The sun gets in your eyes, if it's raining, the rain falls on your face, it gives you no protection for a little warmth. On the other hand, because it retains the 3 points, if you move around in the woods, you will find these points catch on everything. And so it's completely impractical. And so what soldiers in the light infantry did was they modified their hats, they cut them down. As you can see here, what I've done is I've taken a tricorn, very much like this, and I've unfolded the brim and I've cut it down to about 2.5 inches. As you can see, it's quite roughly cut. And what this means is that I have a small brim which will give me a little bit of protection from the sun. It keeps the sun out of my eyes. In bad weather, it provides me a little bit of protection from the rain. So this is a much more practical item of clothing. As you can see, it's got an improvised hat band made from a piece of string tied round, just to help it keep its shape if it does get wet. Now, whilst this is one option, another thing light infantry intended to do was to cut the brims off completely, leaving only a small peak which would provide them that protection from the sun. They'd also attach a skirt made from a piece of wool which would hang around the back, and in cold weather this will protect your ears, your neck and so on from the wind, the rain, the snow, whatever. So this again is a much more practical item of clothing, much less likely to get snagged on things when you're moving around the woods and so on. So a very practical piece of kit, modified from the issue tricorn. The next item I'm going to talk about is my tump line and my bedroll. Now you see this strap that runs across my chest. This carries my blanket, and if I turn to the side you can probably just about see that my blanket rides across my back, and it rides quite high. Now this is an imitation of a native method of carrying equipment, carrying clothing and so on. The natives use this. They use woven straps, often decorated, to carry their blankets. They also use them to carry things like baskets. They use them to pull sleds. It's a very flexible carriage method. The British copied this. You see, the thing about the light infantry is that because they were expected to operate much more independently than line regiments, they couldn't rely on having maybe a baggage train or something to transport their personal items, their clothing and so on. So they needed to have with them everything they were going to need. And so this is why I carry my blanket on me on a tump line. Before I take it off, one thing people often ask is why I carry it across both shoulders, because you could carry it slung crosswise. There are 2 reasons for this. As you can see around my neck, I already have several straps kind of coming across. Now, as I have them at the moment, it's pretty much okay. But if you carry cross straps, they tend to ride, they tend to shift and move, and eventually they start cutting in your neck and become quite uncomfortable. This strap going across has a couple of effects. Firstly, when it's kind of snug and comfortable and in position, it's not going to ride up and hit me in my neck. If anything, it tends to pull slightly downwards. This helps to hold these other straps in place and makes my neck much more comfortable. It's also much easier to remove because I don't have to kind of move my arm much to get it off. All I have to do is pop it over my head, and that's it taken off. Now, as you can see, the tump line is simply a leather strap. These could also be woven from various types of cord, and then there's a length of rope at the end that runs through the centre of my blanket. This is a civilian blanket, probably picked up to replace a worn or damaged issue item, and wrapped in there I have some of my personal kit that I would use if we stopped overnight or camped. I have a pipe and some tobacco. I have a pair of moccasins that I can use if my shoes wear out. I also have a spare shirt, that kind of thing. So this is also a useful way of carrying the kind of the general piece of kit and equipment that you might need around a camp, or you might need if you're staying out overnight or for several nights. So that's my blanket roll. Next I have 2 more pieces of important equipment. I have my haversack, The haversack is where a soldier would carry all of his personal items, food. In here, I'll hopefully do another episode a little later on about what I carry in here, but basically this carries all of those odds and ends that I need to keep with me to survive for, say, 24 hours out on my own. I could go out into the woods, or on patrol I should say. I could go out into the woods with this bag and have pretty much everything I needed to survive for 24 hours. Hopefully watch this space for a slightly more detailed video on the haversack another time. The other item I have is my canteen. Now, all British soldiers were issued with a water canteen for carrying water. However, light infantry were ordered to wrap them in fabric. Now this is wrapped in a piece of wool taken from the lining of my coat. Actually, when I trimmed it down, I'll talk about that later. And this wool just prevents the metal from shining and that shine from kind of glinting or catching anyone's eye. So that's my canteen, as you can see. It's on a rope strap, and it just hangs over my shoulder under my haversack. On the other side, I have my kind of primary ammunition carriage. I have two things. Firstly, I have my ammunition pouch, or my cartridge pouch, I should say. Now this pouch has a large flap and then a small flap underneath, and inside there's a wooden block, and this block holds 21 cartridges. For those who don't know, a cartridge is a quantity of black powder and a ball that have been wrapped up in paper and are sort of the 18th century equivalent of a bullet. This is a measured amount of powder and a ball that will fit the muzzle of my weapon, and I can carry 21 of those in here, and that's going to make up a large percentage of my ammunition. However, again, thinking back to what we were saying about the need for light infantry troops to be flexible, I also have a powder horn. This would also contain black powder, which would mean that I could use it to perhaps load my weapon if I carry some more ball, so some lead ball perhaps in a pocket or a pouch. But I also carry with me a quantity of shot. Now these are much smaller lead balls or pellets that can be useful for shooting for perhaps hunting game and so on. Now there are lots of accounts of British soldiers loading their muskets with a ball and then some buckshot on top. These are kind of pea-sized lead balls on top of the main lead ball. And what happens is when you fire, the lead ball keeps going as it would normally, but the three smaller balls will spread out and will act almost like a kind of shotgun, which increases your chances of hitting whatever you're shooting. So that's perhaps what my powder horn is for. And so I have my crossbelt that carries my cartridge box, and then I have my powder horn.